In Dostoevsky's epic novel, The Brothers Karamazov, one of the central characters, Ivan Karamazov, the brother of Alyosha, recounts a terrible and true tale of a Russian general who allowed an 8-year-old peasant boy to be torn to pieces by his hounds as a revenge for the child having slightly injured one of the dogs. Ivan says, "Listen, if all have to suffer to buy eternal harmony by their sufferings, what have children to do with it? Tell me, please." It is entirely incomprehensible why they should have to buy harmony by their sufferings. I think no reasonable person should disagree with Ivan, but I think he gets the theology of the New Testament wrong. It is not necessary that children have to suffer evil. It serves no real purpose. That action by the Russian general was evil, it was not divine, it was useless, it was senseless, and it was purposeless. I'm Jeff Young. Welcome to part 2 of the problem of evil and suffering. Last time we spoke to the challenge of evil and suffering for people who believe in an omnibenevolent and omnipotent God. Today we will explore a few perspectives from 3 key authors: philosopher and theologian David Bentley Hart, physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne, and philosopher Marilyn McCord Adams. You may have had this experience before. Someone has suffered a tragic evil, but later something good comes as a result. And someone says something to the effect of, or perhaps you've said something to the effect of, God was using that in order to bring about this good thing later on. Well, not exactly. As Hart puts it, evil can have no proper role to play in God's determination of himself or purpose for his creatures, even if by economy God can bring good from evil. Evil can in no way supply any imagined deficiency in God's or creation's goodness. It has no contribution to make. To say evil has some good purpose or is essential to some mysterious divine plan is to suggest, Hart writes, that the world's suffering is not gratuitous, but a necessary contribution to some greater good which could only be realized in this mysterious way. This is a vital observation many do not think through. If God is love, if God is all good, God is never the author of evil, nor does God need evil ever. In James chapter 1, James says, "No one when tempted should say, 'I am being tempted by God,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one." That means God does not produce evil or need to use evil because evil creates temptations to more evil, to anger, to hatred, to violence. Some may say of some suffering, well, God allows it to produce changes in character, to discipline us like a parent. That may be so for some instances. Indeed, some suffering is positive and beneficial, but that does not account for horrendous evils like the Holocaust or other forms of genocide that have no usefulness for the victims or for children. If the Holocaust had some necessity for God to accomplish God's goals, then God appears more like an abusive parent, quite frankly. But when evil does happen, God can bring good from evil by economy. This is often borne out in human experience. The phrase "by economy" means that God can bring certain resources to bear in a situation and bring about some form of good after the fact that evil has occurred. And it may even be a greater good of some sort, but that does not mean that God was the author of evil or willed or desired or needed that evil or that level of evil to take place in order for his purposes to be played out. Hart continues, God has fashioned creatures in his image so that they might be joined in a perfect union with him in the rational freedom of love. For that very reason, what God permits, rather than violate the autonomy of the created world, may be in itself contrary to what God wills. But there is no contradiction in saying that in His omniscience, omnipotence, and transcendence of time, God can both allow created freedom at scope and yet so constitute the world that nothing can prevent Him from bringing about the beatitude of His kingdom. We will expand upon this point when we get to John Polkinghorne's observations, but this is a crucial element: the rational freedom of love, and the fact that what God permits is not the same as what God wills. Parents understand this, even in simple daily practices. Letting children play in the yard, cross the street, participate in sports, be in the presence of other children or adults, drive an automobile. That's a scary proposition when you have a teenager. Yet all of these come with risk due to simple freedom. And that risk includes the possibility of horrific suffering. There is risk in the world. Gravity, which is essential to the existence of life, comes with great risk. It is hard to imagine a world without such risk, at least one with genuine freedom. In a world with some degree of freedom, what is permitted is not always going to be what one wills. And the second observation from Hart is also crucial, that even freedom can be horrifically destructive. This does not mean that all is lost of goodness or love or of meaningfulness, for the Christian faith at least, because of the hope in light of Jesus crucified and risen. And I know that there's issues about that have to be weighed out, but that's the Christian perspective on this. That's all we're talking about right now. And it is that these horrors will be healed and dissolved one day. And that, in my view, is really the only substantive hope. The rest seems to me to be vacuous. For without such hope of a redeemed, restored, and healed life, life will be meaningless and a horror show for many, if not ultimately all, because of the problem of death, which we'll get to later on. And that will be all that life is for the world. The ancient wisdom writer of Ecclesiastes says, "This is an evil, in that all that happens under the sun, the same fate comes to everyone. Moreover, the hearts of all are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after they go to the dead. A living dog is better than a dead lion. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward. Even the memory of them is lost. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished. Never again will they have any share in all that happens under the sun." Ecclesiastes 9. That perspective is coming from a place without hope for life after death. But Hart continues, "Indeed, we must say this: God does not will evil in the sinner. Neither does He will that the sinner should perish. He does not place evil in the heart. He does not desire the convulsive reign of death in nature, but neither will He suffer defeat in these things." So well said. For, after all, if it is from Christ that we are to learn how God relates Himself to sin, suffering, evil, and death, it would seem that He provides us little evidence of anything other than a regal, relentless, and miraculous enmity toward evil. Sin He forgives, suffering He heals, evil He casts out, and death He conquers. Those comments serve as a helpful introduction to our summary of John Polkinghorne on evil, which I think is a good place to start to think about the why of a world that has horrors in it. Again, another author, Richard Creel, argues, the seeming meaninglessness, absurdity, and waste of innocent suffering and tragic loss are overcome only in the existence of God. To be sure, the Holocaust was enormously tragic, but without God, it is even more tragic. Creel continues, "This seems to me to be a terribly important point that Dostoevsky's Ivan, whom we quoted earlier, failed to consider. He was more concerned that his cynicism be vindicated than that the innocent be redeemed. This is a point we raised in our first video. There are many reasons, I believe, for believing in God beyond this, but denying the existence of God because of the existence of unspeakable evil, as much as we ought to question God about such, is premature, short-sighted, and makes the universe utterly meaningless, ultimately. John Polkinghorne writes, "If the universe is to be worthy of creation of the one true God, then it must have about its process the authenticity that we find in great art. Its discords must be part of a greater harmony. Part of the essential character of a work of art is its triumph over the limitations imposed by its medium. The painting's representation of a three-dimensional world on two-dimensional canvas. The sculptor's representation of life and movement in static stone. The play or novel's exploration of a human life in half a dozen episodes. Music's wonderful capacity to speak of eternity by temporal sequence of sound. What are the limitations imposed by the medium of creation for the artist? It is creation's freedom." But a key concept that John Polkinghorne will pick up on here is process, that God works through process. This is a central element that I think Christians, agnostics, atheists, and antagonists of faith all often neglect to consider. Polkinghorne again, "The problem of evil and suffering is a problem of scale, not of simple existence. We've already noted this point. Some suffering has beneficial elements to it. The sorrows and deprivation of life, which in due measure might spur us to beneficial effort, are often experienced as burdens so heavy that they can only subdue and diminish. It is in these matters of degree that the issue of evil is confronted. Herein lies the real problem of evil. What possible providential good is there in children being emotionally, physically, or sexually abused? None, of course. What is the point of entire families being starved, abused, terrorized, and murdered in the Holocaust? And to say God is in control, as far too many Christians do, is to turn God into some sort of monster, it seems to me. And I think there's a lot of problems with that perspective. We'll touch on that again later on. There are two forms of evil that are present in the world: moral evil and natural evil. This is something or sometimes called the free will or free process defense. I don't see it as a defense of God or an answer to the problem of evil, but as part of the possible explanation and part of the answer to evil as we know it. Moral evil, writes Polkinghorne, arises from the willed choices of humankind. It encompasses man's inhumanity, from an abusive parent on an abused child to the national cruelty of oppression and racial discrimination to the global cruelty of exploitation and starvation. Of course, we witness all these almost daily, and especially in our access to worldwide events that has made the world a much smaller place for us all. Dreadful as the resulting sufferings are, the immediate source is clear. They are a result of the exercise of human will. Men and women are directly responsible for them. That responsibility may be diffused, for we are all subject to the pressures of society and of upbringings, but it is primarily located in humanity. Serial killers, Adolf Hitler, Vladimir Putin, and the many deluded by propaganda. The classic answer to the allowed existence of moral evil is the free will defense. Polkinghorne describes it that way. The claim that it is better for God to have created a world of freely choosing beings with the possibility of their voluntary response to Him and to each other, as well as the possibility of sinful selfishness, than to have created a world of blindly obedient automata. This is similar to Hart and others, though Hart is more nuanced on this point. Recall what Hart said earlier: God has fashioned creatures in His image so that they might be joined in a perfect union with Him in the rational freedom of love. How one can weigh the matter is beyond nice calculation, but it is a fundamental human intuition that we are better as we are in all of our flawedness than we would be if we were reduced to automatic action, however beneficially programmed that action might be. And we've all probably seen movies where this happened to someone, usually for some evil purpose. But even if not, we still bristle at the loss of choice. A classic example of this is the movie Get Out. Would we really be fully sentient human beings? Not in any way. At the same time, this counters scientific and Calvinist Reformed determinism, which is both debunked by science and by good theology, it seems to me, in many biblical texts. I plan a future video on that topic, exploring some more thoughts from David Bentley Hart, but also the great Nobel Prize-winning scientist Prigogine. Some have criticized the free will defense by alleging that it should not be beyond the ingenuity of an omnipotent God to create beings who are free, but always freely choose the right. Can we be totally free and yet somehow be programmed to always choose the good? This runs into problems, at least in the near term. The fascinating sci-fi show Westworld illustrates this. But Polkinghorne raises a very important consideration here. Indeed, if that is not the case, that humans can always choose the good, does it not mean that the Christian hope of an eventual triumph of the kingdom of God is incoherent? Unless that kingdom is populated by just such beings, will it not be perpetually precarious and never secure? Christian hope is for a future without evil present, which means only good can be chosen. Here comes a key point in the thinking of Polkinghorne that I believe is critical to how we should see the universe. If God is a God who, out of respect for His creation, acts through process and not by magic, then we must distinguish between what is initially possible and what is eventually possible. In terms of naked power, no doubt God could have created humankind fully fleshed rather than allowing them to emerge after 15 billion years of cosmic history. But He did not do so. That is the patient way that love works. Amen. Now, some more theologically versed listeners might pick up on the term process, and you may presume that Polkinghorne is a process theologian. He is not, but we won't delve into that way of thinking here. Others might be tripped up by the 15 billion year old universe remark. I think that the age of the universe, and that age in particular, is nearly indisputable at this point, and is not contradicted by a proper reading of Genesis chapter 1 in its cultural and literary context. But that's a discussion for another day. I really hope to delve into that. Don't let this point be missed or trip you up at this stage in the game. God works by process. God is deeply patient. More on that again later. Equally, writes Polkinghorne, it may only be in accord with God's nature to produce redeemed humanity through its experience of this veil of soul-making, rather than at a divine stroke or the snap of God's fingers, we might say. Again, that is not to argue God is the author of evil, nor desires evil, nor that He willed horrendous evils to exist, nor needs a veil of horrific soul-making, horrific evil for soul-making, but simply to say that this is a risk God took in giving creation, humans in particular, a necessary freedom flowing out of love. And yet the New Testament and Christian faith declares that the love of God expressed in Jesus will not leave us to that evil, but can and will still transform us and all of creation to a place of beauty and joy. It is also important to remind ourselves that we all function under extraordinarily finite perspectives. This is a famous photo of the Earth from Voyager 1 as it was nearing the edge of our single solar system. Even from within our single solar system, let alone the 200 billion star Milky Way galaxy, we are incredibly small. The famous astronomer Carl Sagan once commented on that photo. If you look at that picture, you see a dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you know, everyone you love, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilizations, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every hopeful child, every mother and father, every inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. In that light, it might turn out that the long history of the creation will one day be seen to be fully justified in some sense. I believe it will, though I continue to cry out to the Creator in lament and protest when I see evil and unimaginable suffering. That is not in itself a reason to believe in the Christian God, but it does seem to me to subvert an immediate move to atheism or unbelief based on the problem of evil. That would be a premature move on our part, given our finitude. My original intent was to include all that John Polkinghorne has to say in this particular video, but I've decided to split it up in two because of the length of it, covering both David Bentley Hart and adding Marilyn McCord Adams into this has just made it too long. So I'm going to divide this into two separate videos, and we'll pick up primarily in the second one with Polkinghorne's discussion, as well as Marilyn McCord Adams, on natural evil and the problems that attend to natural evil. As we close, I simply want to wish you blessings and peace and joy. And if your life is not that, if it's filled with sorrow and suffering and pain, internal or external pain, I hope for your healing and that one day you will be able to experience a whole life, an eternal life of joy and love. And that's something I think well worth hoping for. Thank you. Blessings and peace.